Picture this: the marble-paved streets of the Roman Forum are alive with their usual chorus of voices, merchants hawking imported silks from the east, philosophers holding court beneath shaded colonnades, the clatter of sandals on stone echoing between towering temples. The year is 67 AD, and the air hums with the mingled scents of olive oil, incense, and the faint tang of sea brine carried inland from the Tiber. Yet today, the ordinary rhythm of Rome is broken. A murmur moves like a slow ripple through the crowd. All eyes turn toward the imperial procession. There he is, the emperor himself, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, his figure framed by a retinue of guards in polished armor, their plumes swaying with each step. His face is radiant, almost boyishly proud, and beside him walks a young woman dressed in shimmering silks, her skin luminous beneath the Italian sun, her hair arranged in elaborate curls threaded with pearls. A cascade of jewels rests at her throat, catching the light with every movement. At first glance, the scene could be mistaken for one of Rome's familiar displays of imperial luxury, a victorious general returning from campaign with his new bride, perhaps, or a royal couple blessing the Forum with their presence. But the expressions in the crowd betray something else: unease, disbelief, even horror. The whispers begin in low tones, darting between the marble pillars like furtive birds. Because the truth is not what it seems. That beautiful figure by the emperor's side is no blushing new bride plucked from the noble houses of Rome. She was once a boy, a youth named Sporus, and the journey from boyhood to this surreal role at the emperor's side is a story that will stain the pages of history with equal parts fascination and revulsion. Those who had seen Sporus before the transformation remember a youth with delicate features, soft eyes, a refined bone structure that now seem almost eerie when viewed beside Nero. The likeness is unmistakable, and it is that resemblance which fuels the whispered speculations: she looks like someone they once knew, someone dead. For those with long memories in the Forum, the sight summons an unspoken truth. The girl in silk resembles the late Empress Poppaea Sabina, Nero's great love, whose sudden and violent death 2 years earlier shocked the empire. The likeness is not merely passing. It is uncanny. And to the Romans, such a resemblance is rarely coincidence. But the public knows enough of Nero to guess at the darkness beneath the spectacle. In the imperial palace, there is no separation between desire and decree. A man who rules over 60 million souls can shape reality itself to match the contours of his will. If he wants the dead to walk again, he will find a way, no matter the cost to others. And so the citizens of Rome watch this procession with a curious blend of dread and awe. No one dares speak too loudly, for in Nero's Rome, careless words can become death warrants. A smile is safer, even if forced. A polite bow, even if the stomach churns. This is not a story of romance, though it may wear that mask. It is a story of power wielded without restraint, of grief twisting into obsession, of an emperor's inability to accept loss, and of a young life reshaped into a grotesque echo of the past. In a city where statues of gods gaze down from every corner, even divinity feels less absolute than Nero's command over flesh, over memory, over the very image of love itself. Sporus's tale will not be one of victory. It will be a slow descent into a theater of control where every gesture, every word, and even the very body he inhabits will be dictated by imperial whim. His presence here, on this bright day in the Forum, is only the opening scene of a tragedy that will unfold behind the gilded doors of palaces, across the marble floors of banqueting halls, and ultimately within the shadowed heart of the Colosseum. And yet, even in the midst of the spectacle, there is a sense, subtle but unshakable, that the truth will not remain confined to whispers forever. Rome remembers, and the Forum, with all its noise and clamor, has always been a place where history begins its long echo. Today, we stand at the threshold of one such echo, the story of how an emperor's grief became a nation's spectacle, and how a young man named Sporus was remade into a living doll to serve one man's madness. Before the cruelty, before the whispers, before the name Sporus was ever spoken outside the palace walls, there was a moment when Nero's reign seemed touched by sunlight. He had been only 16 years old when he ascended the throne, barely a man by Roman standards, still with the softness of youth in his face. The Senate, weary from the iron-fisted rule of his predecessors, allowed itself a breath of hope. Here was a new emperor who seemed eager to step out from the shadow of politics' grim machinery and offer something more human, even humane. In the early years, Nero lowered taxes, a gesture warmly received by the plebeians and the provinces alike. He sponsored lavish public games and theatrical performances, making himself visible to the people not as a distant autocrat, but as a man who seemed to revel in their applause. His fascination with art, especially music and acting, was unusual for a Roman ruler, but in those first years it carried a charm. Some citizens whispered that perhaps the golden age Rome had long dreamed of was finally at hand. And it wasn't just spectacle. Nero also sought to improve the capital itself. He invested in public works, renovating theaters, commissioning new aqueducts, and repairing roads that had been left to decay. He positioned himself as a patron of the arts, encouraging poets, painters, and musicians to thrive under his rule. Even the Greek philosophers who found themselves in Rome's orbit dared to hope that this young ruler might bring a gentler, more cultivated spirit to the throne. Of course, in the politics of empire, a benevolent hand can be as dangerous as a cruel one. Nero's generosity often came at the expense of the imperial treasury. Vast sums were poured into games, banquets, and elaborate performances. Yet, for a time, these extravagances bought him genuine popularity among the masses. But the imperial court is not the streets of the Forum, and inside the marble halls, a different current began to stir. The boy emperor was surrounded by men and women twice his age, most of them with ambition sharpened by decades in the poisonous air of Roman politics. Flattery became the language of survival, no one told him no, and few dared to speak plainly. What began as encouragement for Nero's artistic pursuits soon shifted into indulgence, then into the silent enabling of whatever whim seized him. Over time, the isolation grew. Even in a palace filled with hundreds of attendants, Nero found himself alone in a way that only those at the pinnacle of absolute power can be, surrounded yet untouched, observed yet never contradicted. That solitude, historians suggest, planted the seeds of the paranoia that would later define his reign. And then there was the weight of history itself. Nero knew well the fate of emperors who lost their grip, poisonings, assassinations, coups whispered into being in torchlit corridors. He was acutely aware that his hold on power rested on a shifting foundation of Senate approval, Praetorian loyalty, and public adoration. The pressure to be both loved and feared began to distort his judgment. The transformation from promising ruler to dangerous autocrat was not sudden, it was a slow, almost invisible slide. He still smiled for the crowds, still gave them festivals and victories, but behind those gestures a hardening had begun. The young man who once seemed to want to share himself with his people began instead to demand their applause as his right. Perhaps it was inevitable. In the Roman world, absolute power was an intoxicant, and few could resist its pull for long. The philosophers of the time often warned that unchecked authority could rot even the best of men. Seneca, Nero's own tutor, once wrote that no man becomes suddenly base, and he would live to see the truth of that with his own pupil. By the mid-60s AD, the light that had seemed so bright in Nero's first years was already dimming. Behind the layers of silk and the gilded masks of performance, something was shifting, a fragile, insecure core beginning to crack beneath the weight of its own grandeur. And into that widening fracture would soon step a woman whose beauty and ambition would set in motion one of the most disturbing love stories in history. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea Sabina entered Nero's life like a sudden change in the wind, subtle at first, then irresistible. She was already known in Rome's highest circles, the daughter of a wealthy family with old patrician roots, and the widow of a man who had once been a close ally of the emperor's court. But what truly set her apart was the combination of two qualities rarely found together: physical beauty that silenced a room, and a mind sharp enough to navigate the dangerous currents of imperial politics. Ancient writers, even those eager to slander, spoke almost grudgingly of her allure. Her skin was said to be as luminous as polished marble, her features delicate yet commanding. She had the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture when she entered a room, not from fear, but from an instinctive awareness of being in the company of someone extraordinary. Poppaea understood this power and cultivated it with care: perfumes from Arabia, silks dyed in the deep purples reserved for the highest ranks, hair styled in complex arrangements that had become the envy of patrician women across the city. When Nero first saw her, he was already married to Claudia Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, Claudius. That marriage had been a matter of politics, not passion. Octavia was dutiful, reserved, and painfully shy, a model Roman matron in the eyes of the Senate, but to Nero she was little more than a political necessity. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not: vivacious, socially fearless, and adept at placing herself at the center of attention without ever seeming to demand it. The attraction was instantaneous. To the outside world, it began as yet another imperial affair, scandalous but hardly unusual in Rome, where the private conduct of emperors was often the city's favorite sport. Yet what started as a dalliance quickly hardened into something more dangerous. Nero did not simply want Poppaea in his bed, he wanted her in his life, his court, his future. Historians disagree on whether Poppaea encouraged his obsession or simply knew how to survive it. She was no naive girl dazzled by imperial attention. She understood the hazards of proximity to power and the fine balance required to maintain favor without losing her independence. Some accounts suggest she flattered Nero's ego while subtly steering his decisions, others claim she openly challenged him, confident in her hold over him. Both may be true. In Rome, beauty was never just beauty, it was currency. Poppaea spent hers wisely. She had the wit to keep Nero amused, the ambition to match his grand dreams, and the political instincts to make herself indispensable. She made friends where they mattered, building quiet alliances among influential senators, court officials, and members of the Praetorian Guard. Still, the danger was always there. Nero's temper was a thing of legend even in his youth, and he was unused to hearing the word no. Poppaea must have known that she walked a narrow bridge above a deep drop. But she also knew that without risk, there was no reward. It didn't take long for Nero's infatuation to turn into a public fact. He began appearing with her at festivals, inviting her to private banquets where the city's elite watched every exchanged glance and word. Octavia's position became increasingly awkward. The empress was still loved by the people, but her quiet dignity only made Nero's growing neglect more obvious. The gossip moved quickly from whispered corners of the palace to the bustling markets. Merchants repeated it to their customers, slaves carried it in murmured conversations across the Tiber, and senators spoke of it in guarded tones in the marble halls of the Curia. Rome had seen imperial affairs before, but this felt different. There was an intensity in the way Nero looked at Poppaea, a hunger that suggested he would not be satisfied with her as a mistress. And indeed, Nero soon made his intentions clear. He would not remain bound to Octavia. Divorce was not just possible, it was inevitable. It would scandalize the court, anger the Senate, and risk the loyalty of the people, but Nero seemed unconcerned. His eyes were fixed on Poppaea, and in that gaze was the first glimmer of the obsession that would one day consume them both. For Claudia Octavia, the writing on the wall came long before the official decree. She had been raised in the palace, groomed from childhood to be an empress. Her mother, the infamous Messalina, had been executed when Octavia was still a girl, leading her to grow up under the cold protection of her father, Emperor Claudius. Her marriage to Nero, arranged when he was still a teenager, was meant to bind together two branches of the imperial family and secure political stability. It had never been a marriage of love. Octavia's life with Nero was marked by distance and formality, and by the time Poppaea Sabina entered the picture, the bond was brittle enough to snap. But in Rome, divorcing an empress was not as simple as setting aside a wife. Octavia's popularity with the people was a shield, and Nero knew it. The common citizens admired her dignity, her quiet charity, and her refusal to involve herself in the vicious intrigues of court life. Poppaea, however, understood the mechanics of destruction. If Octavia could not be toppled by scandal of her own making, then a scandal would be made for her. Ancient historians, often biased, but in this case eerily consistent, record that Poppaea began whispering accusations into Nero's ear. Octavia, she hinted, was barren. It was not Nero's fault that no heir had been born from their union, it was hers. In a society that viewed fertility as a woman's chief duty, this was more than an insult, it was a political liability. Whether Octavia was truly infertile remains unknown, but the charge was powerful. Soon, more rumors were woven in, that she was cold, unfaithful, even conspiring against her husband. Nero's court, ever eager to curry favor, amplified the whispers. In 62 AD, Nero made his move. Octavia was formally divorced, on the grounds of sterility. The reaction in Rome was immediate and intense. The people adored her and viewed Poppaea as an interloper. Crowds gathered in protest, chanting Octavia's name and condemning Nero's decision. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, showed signs of unease, a dangerous omen for any ruler. Nero, rattled but determined, initially attempted a compromise. Octavia was banished from the palace but allowed to live in a villa under house arrest. The hope was that public outrage would cool with time. It did not. Poppaea, fearing that Octavia's continued existence was a rallying point for dissent, is said to have pressed harder. According to Tacitus, she warned Nero that as long as Octavia lived, he would never be truly free or safe. The charge of infertility had not been enough. Now, she needed a more damning accusation. Treason was chosen. The machinery of Roman justice, when directed by an emperor's will, could move with terrible speed. Octavia's servants were tortured until some produced confessions of her involvement in a conspiracy. Evidence was irrelevant, the point was the sentence. Within days, Octavia was condemned. Her final fate was as brutal as it was swift. She was sent to the island of Pandateria, the same barren exile spot where disgraced empresses before her had been cast away. But even there, her life was short. Orders came from Rome, execution, under the pretense of suicide. She was barely 20 years old. The news of her death sent a shudder through the city. Statues of Octavia were adorned with flowers by grieving citizens, while in the shadows, the more cynical whispered that Rome had just seen the first true proof of Poppaea's influence over Nero. And now, with Octavia gone, there was no obstacle left between Poppaea Sabina and the imperial crown. The wedding came quickly. Nero's new empress stepped into her role with calculated grace, her triumph total. But the bond between Nero and Poppaea, sealed in victory, would not bring peace. It would instead deepen into a relationship as volatile as it was passionate, a union that would scorch everything in its path. The wedding of Nero and Poppaea Sabina was not just a union of two people, it was a public spectacle designed to announce the beginning of a new imperial era. Rome was draped in garlands, sacrifices were made to the gods, and the city's streets filled with music and incense. Nero, wearing robes of Tyrian purple, stood beside his bride, whose gown shimmered like liquid gold in the torchlight. To the watching crowd, she appeared less like a mortal woman and more like a goddess descending to claim her throne. But behind the splendor, the marriage was already dangerous ground. Nero was still in his mid-20s, impulsive and prone to fits of both lavish generosity and terrifying cruelty. Poppaea, though now empress, was no passive ornament. She was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to hold the influence she had fought so ruthlessly to gain. Their relationship burned with the intensity of two strong wills locked together, intoxicating when they were in harmony, destructive when they clashed. At first, the union seemed to work in Nero's favor. Poppaea proved to be a skilled hostess and a shrewd partner in political theater. She advised him on how to win public favor, often suggesting lavish games, chariot races, and public feasts to keep the citizens entertained. She also encouraged him to indulge his love of the arts, music, poetry, and above all, public performance. Yet this encouragement had a sharp edge. Poppaea's vision for the empire was one in which Nero's power was unquestioned, his authority absolute. Those who opposed him, whether senators, courtiers, or former allies, found themselves quietly removed, disgraced, or worse. Ancient sources, hostile as they may have been, agree that she had little patience for mercy. Her guiding principle seemed to be that a threat, once recognized, should be eliminated completely. Their private life was as intense as their public one. Poppaea knew how to charm Nero, how to flatter his vanity and soothe his insecurities. But she also knew how to wound him with precision when angered. Their arguments were the stuff of palace legend, sharp words, slammed doors, and sudden reconciliations that could be just as heated as the quarrels. The marriage reached a high point when Poppaea became pregnant. For Nero, the prospect of an heir was both a political triumph and a personal joy. He lavished her with gifts and had special care taken to ensure her comfort. Messengers were sent to the far corners of the empire for the finest delicacies, and her chambers were filled with scented flowers. When the child was born, a daughter named Claudia Augusta, Nero celebrated with extravagant games and distributed gifts to the populace. For a brief moment, the imperial couple seemed untouchable, the embodiment of Rome's power and prosperity. But fate, as ever, was merciless. Claudia Augusta lived only 4 months before dying unexpectedly. The loss devastated Poppaea. Ancient accounts describe her retreating into mourning, her grief both genuine and politically dangerous. Without an heir, her position was less secure. Nero, unable or unwilling to fully comprehend her sorrow, threw himself into public entertainments, perhaps to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the palace. The cracks in their marriage began to widen. Poppaea, once an ally in Nero's ambitions, grew sharper in her criticisms. She questioned his decisions, his extravagance, even his artistic pursuits when they threatened to overshadow his duties as emperor. Nero, unused to such challenges, responded with bursts of defensiveness and anger. Still, their passion remained. Friends and enemies alike remarked on the strange intensity of their bond, a mixture of love, pride, and rivalry that kept drawing them back to each other, even as it set them on a course toward tragedy. What neither could see, or perhaps neither wished to see, was that the same fire that had forged their union was also consuming it. And soon, that fire would burn past the point of return. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was a city within a city, a labyrinth of echoing corridors, candlelit chambers, and courtyards where the sound of running water masked the whispers of servants. In such a place, nothing remained private for long. Every word spoken by the emperor or empress could ripple outward, warped and repeated, until it reached the ears of the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, or the bustling streets of the Forum. It was in this atmosphere that the tension between Nero and Poppaea began to ferment into something darker. To the public, they still appeared as a golden couple, hosting grand banquets and presiding over spectacles. Yet those closest to the throne, chamberlains, scribes, and imperial advisers, could feel the change. The air between them seemed heavier, conversations shorter, and the silences that followed more telling than the words exchanged. Poppaea, already known for her sharp tongue, became more openly critical. She accused Nero of neglecting the governance of the empire in favor of his artistic pursuits. Nights that should have been spent in council with advisors were instead dedicated to rehearsals, poetry recitals, and music. Rome's coffers, though still rich, were beginning to feel the strain of his extravagance. Nero, for his part, bristled at her interference. He was emperor, and he would rule as he pleased. To him, Poppaea's reminders of fiscal restraint or political necessity felt like attempts to diminish his glory. He accused her of undermining him before his own advisers, and in moments of anger, implied that her ambitions had always been for herself rather than for Rome. The court was quick to take sides, though carefully. Some ministers aligned with Poppaea, believing her to be the steadier hand, more concerned with stability than self-indulgence. Others flattered Nero's ego, feeding him reassurances that the empress's counsel was unnecessary, even dangerous. Adding fuel to the fire were persistent rumors, whether true or planted, that Nero's eye was wandering. His reputation for affairs was well known, and though Poppaea herself had once been the other woman, she had no intention of being replaced. Every hint of another woman in his company, every sly remark overheard at a banquet, deepened her resentment. Outside the palace walls, Rome itself was restless. The city's mood was shifting, the novelty of Nero's performances on stage was wearing thin, and murmurs of dissatisfaction began to rise from the Senate and the people alike. Poppaea urged caution, warning him that his growing obsession with artistic glory risked alienating the elite and undermining the empire's dignity. Nero, in turn, accused her of jealousy, not of other women, but of his talent. Their quarrels grew in frequency and ferocity. Sometimes they ended in reconciliation, lavish gifts, tender words, and evenings spent in apparent harmony. Other times, the wounds lingered. It was during one such reconciliation that Poppaea revealed she was pregnant again. The news momentarily calmed the storms between them. Nero promised her every luxury, and for a time, the palace seemed bathed in a fragile peace. Poppaea's chambers filled with silks, musicians played softly in the evenings, and rare fruits arrived from distant provinces. Yet beneath the surface, nothing had been resolved. Their love had become a volatile thing, capable of tenderness one moment and destruction the next. And now, with a new heir on the way, the stakes were higher than ever. The marble halls of the Palatine had heard many whispers before. But in the months to come, they would echo with a silence far heavier than any rumor, one that would mark the beginning of the end. The summer heat in Rome could be oppressive, turning the city into a furnace of stone and dust. The palace courtyards shimmered under the relentless sun, and even the marble floors radiated warmth. In such weather, tempers were quick to flare, and in the imperial household, the smallest spark could ignite an inferno. Poppaea, now heavily pregnant, spent most of her days in shaded chambers, reclining on couches draped with cool linen. Her servants fanned her constantly, and bowls of crushed ice were brought in from the mountains to chill her drinks. Despite the outward care, those who attended her closely noticed she seemed tense, her eyes sharper, her voice more cutting when displeased. Nero's attentions were erratic. Some days, he visited her with rare tenderness, reading poetry to her, playing the lyre softly at her side, and speaking of the future child with uncharacteristic gentleness. On other days, he disappeared for hours or even nights, absorbed in rehearsals for a new performance or in private gatherings with companions who cared little for the empress's condition. Court gossip began to swell again. Some whispered that Nero was impatient with her constant admonitions, others claimed he resented the restrictions her pregnancy placed on their life. Poppaea, for her part, had grown bolder in her criticisms. She accused him, sometimes in public, of neglecting her and the responsibilities of the empire. Such public rebukes were humiliating for a man whose vanity was as delicate as it was vast. One stifling afternoon, after a heated exchange over his absence from a scheduled council meeting, their quarrel reached a breaking point. Ancient sources, colored by the bias of later historians, tell different versions of what happened next. Some claim Nero, in a fit of rage, struck her violently. Others insist it was an accident, a sudden push during an argument that ended with her collapsing in pain. What is certain is that Poppaea's condition worsened rapidly. The palace physicians, summoned in haste, could do nothing. Before the day was over, the empress was dead, and with her, the unborn child. Rome was stunned. Official proclamations framed her death as the result of illness, a tragic loss for the empire. But the whispers in the marble halls told a different story, one of temper and pride, of love that had rotted into something cruel. Nero, perhaps shaken by the magnitude of what had happened, ordered her body embalmed and given a funeral of unmatched splendor. Ivory statues of Poppaea were erected, her body adorned with jewels, and her memory honored as though she had been a goddess among mortals. He spoke of her beauty, her virtues, and the grief that would haunt him forever. Yet for those who had known them both, the spectacle was a mask. They had seen the cracks, the quarrels, the deep wounds neither had been willing to heal. And now, beneath the summer sun, Rome buried its empress, leaving only the uneasy silence of a palace where love had burned too brightly and far too fast. The palace felt different after Poppaea's death. The marble halls that once rang with her sharp commands and silken laughter seemed unnaturally still, as though the air itself had been stripped of purpose. Servants moved more cautiously, their eyes lowered, for they knew the walls still remembered the final argument, the shouts, the crash, the sudden hush that followed. Nero, for all his public proclamations of grief, did not retreat into mourning as some had expected. Instead, he threw himself into spectacles. Days after her funeral rites, where her body had been paraded through Rome in a gilded litter surrounded by clouds of incense, he staged grand performances, both as emperor and artist, his face painted, his voice trembling with emotion. To the Senate and the people, he framed these acts as tributes to her memory. But to those who knew him, it seemed more like an escape from the weight of what had happened. The funeral itself had been unlike any Rome had ever seen. Poppaea's body, embalmed with rare spices and dressed in robes of dazzling white, was placed upon a bier adorned with gold and pearls. Statues of her likeness lined the route to the mausoleum of Augustus, their ivory faces fixed in eternal serenity. Citizens tossed flowers into the procession, while actors recited verses celebrating her beauty and devotion. It was less a funeral than a coronation for the dead, a final assertion of her place as Rome's empress. Yet beneath the layers of pomp, the truth remained uncertain. The official version, death from sudden illness, was repeated in every proclamation. But behind closed doors, senators whispered that she had been struck down in anger, while others claimed the gods had punished her for pride. Whatever the truth, no one dared speak it openly. For Nero, Poppaea's absence left a vacuum, not of affection, perhaps, but of control. She had been one of the few who could temper his impulses, who could shape his ambitions with strategic counsel. Without her, his circle narrowed to flatterers and sycophants, men and women who fed his vanity and indulged his whims. Her death also altered the political landscape. Families who had feared her influence now saw opportunities to rise. Rivalries that she had kept in check flared anew. The Senate, though still wary of Nero's temper, found subtle ways to reassert itself, sensing the emperor's isolation. And yet, despite everything, Nero seemed unwilling to let her go entirely. He had her deified, commissioning temples and altars where she would be worshipped as Diva Poppaea Augusta. Coins bearing her image continued to be minted, her face staring serenely from the silver as though untouched by the chaos that had surrounded her in life. But the silence in the palace could not be gilded over forever. Those who had seen the truth knew that it was not the gods who had taken the empress, it was the very fire that had bound her to Nero. A fire that, once unleashed, had consumed her entirely. In time, that same fire would turn on Nero himself. In the months that followed, the palace became a strange reflection of itself, lavish as ever, yet lacking a heartbeat. Poppaea's private chambers were left untouched, as though she might walk back into them at any moment. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the air, her gowns hung in neat rows, her favorite mirrors and ivory combs resting where she had last placed them. Some said Nero ordered it so, others believed no one dared disturb her belongings for fear of the emperor's unpredictable moods. Nero's grief, if grief it was, took eccentric forms. He began to speak of her in the present tense, addressing empty spaces in the room as though she stood beside him. At banquets, he would raise his cup and toast her, commanding musicians to play the melodies she loved. Sometimes, in a more disquieting display, he had actors perform scenes in which an empress was resurrected by the gods, bathed in divine light. Court rumor fed on these habits. Some claimed Nero sought the aid of magicians to call her spirit back. Others whispered, half in fear, half in fascination, that he had found a woman bearing a striking resemblance to Poppaea and had taken her into the palace. Whether she was merely a distraction or something more uncanny was a question none dared to answer aloud. The people of Rome, for their part, were divided. Many mourned Poppaea sincerely, recalling her beauty and her skill in maintaining the emperor's favor. Others remembered her ambition and cruelty, muttering that her death was justice from the gods. But whatever they believed, her absence left a mark on the empire's image. With her gone, Nero seemed untethered, his reign shifting from erratic to outright dangerous. Political undercurrents began to swirl. Without Poppaea to temper his more reckless impulses, Nero's advisors no longer bothered to restrain his extravagance. Colossal sums vanished into theatrical productions, public games, and architectural dreams so grand they seemed almost impossible. The Senate watched warily, its patience thinning, while military commanders in the provinces began to question whether Rome's emperor was more actor than ruler. Yet in Nero's mind, the narrative was different. He saw himself as a tragic hero, a man cursed by the loss of the woman who had truly understood him. In his performances, he began to weave elements of her story into the roles he played, blurring the line between public art and private obsession. But obsessions, left unchecked, can become the seeds of ruin. The echoes of Poppaea's voice, whether imagined or remembered, continued to guide him, sometimes as a muse, sometimes as an accusation. And as the years would show, the shadow she left behind was not one that Nero could ever outrun. Barely a year after Poppaea's death, Nero presented Rome with a new empress, Statilia Messalina. To the public, it was framed as a union of beauty and nobility, another jewel in the imperial crown. But those who knew the whispers behind the marble walls understood the darker truth. Statilia had been married to a prominent senator, Vestinus Atticus, until Nero's will intervened. Vestinus was compelled, some say by political intimidation, others by the quiet threat of imperial justice, to take his own life, clearing the path for Nero's desires. Statilia was everything Nero prized, graceful, intelligent, and possessed of a calm elegance that contrasted with Poppaea's sharper brilliance. Yet those who compared the two women often noted something uncanny. Statilia, though different in manner, shared certain qualities of dress, gesture, and even speech with the late empress. Whether this was coincidence or the result of Nero's influence was left unsaid, but the resemblance kept Poppaea's ghost alive in the court. Rome received the new marriage with uneasy curiosity. Some senators saw it as a signal that the emperor was stabilizing, returning to the structures of respectable rule. Others recognized it as yet another example of his will bending the fates of others. For the people, the shift was less about politics than spectacle. They watched to see if the new empress would hold his attention as firmly as Poppaea once had. In private, Nero surrounded Statilia with the luxuries once reserved for his late wife. He gifted her jewels that had belonged to Poppaea, draped her in robes of imperial purple, and took her to the same gardens, the same banquet halls, as though replaying scenes from a life already lived. Some in the palace staff whispered that it was not Statilia he loved, but the memory she replaced. Still, Statilia was no passive figure. She understood the dangers of her position. The fate of Octavia and Poppaea were warnings carved into the very air she breathed. She moved carefully, never contradicting the emperor in public, never showing jealousy or disapproval. To outsiders, she appeared serene. To those closer to the truth, she was a woman navigating a storm by remaining perfectly still. Yet even as he embraced his new empress, Nero's reign showed signs of decay. The provinces murmured with unrest, the Senate's patience frayed, and the treasury bled silver into his endless spectacles. The marriage to Statilia could not conceal the cracks forming in the empire's foundation. In the quiet of the night, when the torches in the palace corridors burned low, some claimed they could hear the faint sound of a woman's voice in Nero's chambers, not Statilia's, but another, colder, older, echoing from the past. And Nero, they said, sometimes answered it. The year after Nero's marriage to Statilia was marked by strange occurrences, the kind Romans often took as signs from the gods. Lightning struck the temple of Jupiter, splitting a statue from crown to base. A comet blazed across the summer sky, its long tail bleeding light over the city. In the marketplaces, soothsayers whispered of bloodlines ending, of an empire standing on the edge of collapse. Nero, though publicly dismissive of superstition, was privately unsettled. He had always been sensitive to omens, interpreting them in ways that suited his desires. But these signs were harder to twist into fortune. In his private councils, he summoned astrologers, philosophers, even Egyptian magi, seeking interpretations that would ease his mind. Most told him what he wanted to hear, that the omens foretold his enemy's downfall. A few, braver or more reckless, hinted that they spoke instead of his own fate. Those voices were not heard from again. Meanwhile, unrest in the provinces deepened. In Gaul, rumors swelled of discontent among the legions. In the east, governors hesitated to send their usual tributes, claiming depleted coffers. The Senate grew more restless, aware that the emperor's attention was fixed on art and performance rather than the realities of governance. Statilia, observing from the periphery, understood that Nero's focus was narrowing toward a dangerous point. At night, Nero's dreams grew troubled. He saw Poppaea's face, not radiant as in life, but pale and accusing. Sometimes she stood at the edge of his vision, silent. Other times, she spoke in a voice both tender and cold, warning him that the empire he had built was rotting from within. Nero would wake in a sweat, summoning his musicians to drown the lingering echoes with lyre and song. Yet, even in daylight, the omens found him. During a chariot race, a wheel shattered under the lead team, sending the emperor sprawling onto the sand. He rose unhurt, but the crowd's gasp still rang in his ears. Later, a statue of himself in the forum was found toppled and broken at the neck. These incidents were explained away as accidents, but to those who believed in signs, the meaning was clear: Rome's favor was shifting. Despite this, Nero doubled down on spectacle, declaring that Rome needed beauty, not fear. He commissioned grand games, extravagant feasts, and new monuments, each more excessive than the last. Yet beneath the gold and silk, a tension wound tighter, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. And somewhere in that tension, the memory of Poppaea lingered, no longer merely a ghost, but an omen in herself, a reminder that the fall of the Empress had been the first crack in the marble of Nero's world. By now, Nero's identity as emperor and performer had merged so completely that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He no longer treated public appearances as duties of state but as acts in an endless drama, with himself as both playwright and star. Rome's Senate chambers became his backstage, the Forum, his stage, the empire itself, his audience. He performed not just in music and poetry but in the very governance of the realm. Decrees were issued like scenes in a play, designed to provoke gasps, applause, or outrage, whichever suited the moment. His speeches were delivered with theatrical flourishes, his expressions calculated for effect. In Nero's mind, the empire was not merely ruled, it was directed. Statilia understood the danger in this transformation. Rome was a city of traditions, where dignity and restraint had long been pillars of imperial authority. Nero, by contrast, sought to rewrite the script entirely. He invited foreign dignitaries to witness his singing and lyre playing, forcing even seasoned generals to sit through hours of his tragedies. Those who nodded off or failed to appear suitably moved were noted, and later, quietly removed from their posts. But art, for Nero, was not an escape from politics, it was a weapon within it. Through his performances, he shaped the narrative of his reign. In one play, he portrayed a king betrayed by his closest allies, rallying the crowd's sympathy. In another, he played a god who defied death itself, his voice rising to near hysteria as he spoke of love enduring beyond the grave. Many whispered that these roles were veiled confessions of his obsession with Poppaea, and perhaps a warning to those who thought him vulnerable. The people, for a time, were enthralled. Bread and spectacle kept their bellies full and their minds distracted, even as taxes climbed and unrest simmered in the provinces. The streets of Rome buzzed with tales of the emperor's voice, his beauty in the spotlight, his strange but mesmerizing intensity. Yet not all were charmed. Among the Senate, there was growing resentment that the emperor valued the stage over the state. Generals grumbled that while Nero sang, their legions went unpaid. Governors muttered about imperial neglect as rebellions flickered in the far reaches of the empire. Still, Nero saw no danger, only the applause. In his mind, the theater was his triumph, the proof of his genius. Rome would remember him not as a tyrant, but as the greatest artist to wear the laurel crown. But an audience's love is fickle. And in the wings, unseen but waiting, were those who had grown tired of the play, and were ready to end it before the final act. Beyond the marble and gold of Rome's heart, the empire's edges began to fray. In the distant province of Gallia Lugdunensis, the governor Gaius Julius Vindex, a man of Gallic blood but Roman allegiance, grew restless under the weight of imperial neglect. Nero's obsession with art and spectacle had left the provinces overtaxed and underdefended, their grievances piling like dry timber awaiting a spark. That spark came in whispers. Vindex, tall and commanding, began to speak privately of restoring Rome to dignity, of placing a man of true Roman virtue upon the throne. He did not shout treason, at least, not at first. But his words carried in the taverns of Lugdunum, in the camps of soldiers, in the markets where merchants cursed the emperor's greed. Soon, the whispers grew louder. Rome's treasury, drained by Nero's endless festivals and building projects, demanded heavier tribute from the provinces. In Gaul, This meant crushing taxes on farmers already worn thin by poor harvests. In Spain, it meant levies so high that trade faltered. In the East, governors delayed sending coin at all. The empire was a stage on which the emperor sang, but behind the curtain, the props were breaking and the stagehands were abandoning their posts. Vindex knew the danger of moving too soon. But he also knew that others shared his discontent, men with legions at their command, men who had endured Nero's insults and humiliations. Among them was a figure in distant Hispania Tarraconensis, Sergius Sulpicius Galba, a seasoned general of noble blood. Galba had kept his silence under Nero's reign, but his reputation for discipline and old Roman virtue made him a natural rallying point. As spring approached, Vindex made his choice. In secret councils, he pledged himself to Galba, declaring him the rightful leader of Rome. The alliance was dangerous. Open defiance of Nero was a gamble that could end on the executioner's block. But the tide of resentment was rising, and Vindex believed the provinces were ready to ride it. Meanwhile, in Rome, Nero remained oblivious. Reports of unrest reached the imperial court, but he dismissed them as petty grievances, the noise of provincial malcontents. To him, the idea that a governor in some distant province could threaten his rule was laughable. Instead, he planned another grand performance, one that would eclipse all others. He envisioned a tour through Greece, where he would compete in the sacred games, gathering laurels not as emperor but as an artist. The Senate gritted its teeth, the generals muttered in private, but none dared to tell him that the empire he would leave behind during his tour was already beginning to revolt. The first cracks had widened, and through them, rebellion was seeping in. For years, Nero had spoken of Greece with the yearning of a pilgrim for a holy land. To him, it was the birthplace of beauty, the cradle of art, the home of gods who, like himself, understood the glory of performance. Now, with the empire restless and the Senate uneasy, he decided it was the perfect time to leave Rome behind and immerse himself in the land of his dreams. The plan was not merely to visit but to conquer, not with legions, but with song, lyre, and verse. Nero would enter every sacred competition, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games at Argos, and the crown jewel, the Olympian Games themselves. Tradition decreed these events every 4 years, but tradition bent easily under the weight of imperial will. Nero commanded that the games be held in a single tour, rearranging ancient calendars to suit his own glory. The court was swept into a frenzy of preparation. Musicians tuned their instruments, poets refined their verses, and architects planned triumphal arches to be erected in every Greek city he would grace. Nero's wardrobe alone filled entire ships, costumes of gods, heroes, and tragic kings, each embroidered with gold and dyed in the rarest colors. But even in the splendor of this vision, shadows lingered. The cost of the journey was staggering, draining yet more from a treasury already bleeding. Ships were requisitioned from provinces that could ill afford them, crews conscripted from unwilling ports. Senators protested in private, but in public, they lavished praise on the emperor's sacred mission. Statilia, who had long learned to keep her counsel, watched with quiet unease. She knew that Greece would give Nero the adoration he craved, its people, steeped in the traditions of theater and poetry, would cheer his every note. But she also knew that while he basked in their praise, Rome would be left to fester. As spring turned to summer, Nero set sail, his fleet gleaming under the sun. At every port along the way, crowds gathered, both out of curiosity and compulsion, to greet the emperor artist. In Corinth, he declared the city free of Roman taxes for all time, winning the people's love at the expense of Rome's coffers. In Olympia, he shocked the world by entering not only the musical competitions but also the chariot races, driving a team of 10 horses, twice the usual number, in a display of audacity and danger. He fell from the chariot midway through the race but was, nonetheless, crowned victor. For Nero, Greece was paradise. He was praised, adored, and laurel-crowned in city after city. The cheers were intoxicating, and he drank them like wine. He believed he was building a legacy of cultural immortality. But across the sea, the legacy of his empire was cracking. News from Gaul and Spain grew darker, messages from governors became more urgent. Still, the emperor sang on, deaf to the rising storm. The Greek dream was his stage, and he would not hear the drums of war in the wings. While Nero bathed in Greek applause, Gaul burned, not with literal fire, but with the fever of revolt. Gaius Julius Vindex had stepped from whispered dissent into open defiance. In a bold declaration, he denounced Nero as a disgrace to Rome and called upon the provinces to rise. His words spread like lightning through the legions, carried by messengers, deserters, and merchants who repeated them in every marketplace. Vindex's appeal was not to the mob, but to those who commanded armies. He named Galba in Hispania as the man worthy of the purple. By invoking Galba, he offered the rebellion not just outrage, but a figurehead, a leader whose patrician blood and military record could unite Rome's disaffected elite. The response was electric. Some provincial governors hesitated, unwilling to commit until they knew which way the wind would blow. Others quietly began mustering troops, their loyalty to Nero already frayed by years of neglect and insult. The legions, long starved of pay while Nero squandered fortunes on theater, found the cause tempting. In Lugdunum, however, the governor Lucius Virginius Rufus refused to join the rebellion. Loyal to the Senate and suspicious of Vindex's Gallic roots, he instead raised an army to oppose him. The two forces, both Roman in training, both sworn to protect the empire, now faced one another across the plains of Gaul. In Rome, the news could no longer be dismissed as minor unrest. Letters from the Senate and the Praetorian prefect urged Nero to return, warning that the rebellion threatened to spread. Yet Nero, deep in his Greek tour, treated the crisis as an annoying interruption. He vowed to crush the rebels but refused to abandon his performances. Instead, he sent orders to loyal commanders to handle the matter, while he completed his tour and collected his crowns. But rebellion has its own tempo. Before Nero could even consider returning, the clash came. At Vesontio, the forces of Vindex and Virginius Rufus met. It was not the Senate's will but the soldiers' temper that decided the outcome. The legions of Rufus, stirred by old rivalries and distrust of provincial-born commanders, attacked without waiting for orders. The battle was brutal but brief. Vindex's army was routed, and Vindex himself, seeing the cause lost, took his own life rather than face capture. When news of his death reached Nero, the emperor exhaled in relief. He declared the rebellion extinguished and congratulated himself for having managed the crisis from afar. What he failed to grasp was that the fire had not gone out, it had only changed direction. Galba still lived. And now, with Vindex dead, he stood alone as the rallying point for all who despised Nero. The storm in Gaul had broken, but the thunder was still rolling toward Rome. In Hispania Tarraconensis, Servius Sulpicius Galba had received word of Vindex's death with a face that betrayed neither triumph nor despair. The governor was a man of deliberate movement, his years of command teaching him to value patience over impulse. Yet patience did not mean inaction. The death of Vindex removed a risky ally, but it also cleared the stage for Galba to emerge without sharing the spotlight. At first, Galba had not openly declared himself emperor. He styled himself instead as the legate of the Senate and people of Rome, a defender of the old republic's dignity against Nero's tyranny. But among his closest advisers, the truth was plain: this was the first step toward the purple. The legions under his command were loyal, though their loyalty was less to Galba's person than to the idea of a leader who would restore military honor and pay. In whispered councils, Galba promised the soldiers rewards, reform, and the respect they had been denied under Nero's theatrical reign. Messages arrived from other provinces. Africa was restless. Germania was undecided. The East remained quiet but watchful. The Praetorian Guard in Rome, the emperor's own protectors, had grown disillusioned with Nero, their loyalty eroded by erratic orders and dwindling donatives. Galba's envoys courted them carefully, promising gold and a future under a sober, disciplined ruler. By midsummer, Galba took the decisive step. In Carthago Nova, before his assembled troops, he declared himself legatus senatus populique Romani, no longer a mere governor, but the Senate's chosen guardian. His words carried the weight of inevitability. To the soldiers, it meant a change of master. To Rome, it meant civil war. Far away in Greece, Nero was still accepting laurel wreaths and basking in the worship of crowds. The dispatches that reached him were carefully worded, softening the scale of the crisis. He laughed off the idea that a 70-year-old relic like Galba could threaten his throne. Yet the machinery of rebellion was already in motion. Galba's declaration was a call to every discontented province, every slighted commander, every senator who saw Nero's reign as a danger to Rome itself. The rebellion was no longer about Gaul, it was about the very survival of the empire's dignity. Galba began marching his forces north, toward Gaul, not to fight Virginius Rufus, but to secure his position and wait for the inevitable moment when Rome's own heart would falter. It was not a question of whether Nero would fall. Only how and when. In Rome, the air was thick with rumor. The marketplaces, the baths, even the marble corridors of the Senate echoed with cautious voices. News of Galba's declaration had reached the city, though in fragments, each retelling shaped by the speaker's hopes or fears. To the common people, weary of famine and spectacle, the talk was confusing. Nero still held his games and distributed occasional grain, but whispers claimed that the emperor was bleeding the treasury dry to pay for his Greek tour. Some said Galba would restore stability, others warned he would be a harsher master. Among the Senate, however, the mood was shifting. The body that once flattered Nero now began to calculate his chances of survival. Senators weighed family ties, private grievances, and the likelihood of Galba's victory. A few still clung to the emperor out of genuine loyalty or fear of reprisal. Most waited, watching for the first sign that Nero's grip had slipped. In the Palatine, the Praetorian Guard muttered in their barracks. Their commander, Nymphidius Sabinus, had ambitions of his own. A man of towering presence and shameless ambition, Sabinus understood the art of survival in turbulent times, backed the winner early enough to be rewarded, but late enough to avoid suspicion. He had begun sounding out his officers, floating the possibility that Nero's days were numbered. Letters from Greece arrived irregularly, each filled with Nero's triumphs in verse and theater. The emperor wrote as though the world cared more for his performance in Corinth than for the movements of armies. He made no mention of marching back to Rome. Instead, he sent instructions for preparations to celebrate his return, more games, more processions, more monuments to himself. Yet beneath the surface, the city trembled. Grain ships from Africa were delayed, driving up prices. Minor riots broke out in the Subura. The treasury, strained by Nero's extravagances, delayed payments to the guard. Each delay was another crack in the dam. Nymphidius Sabinus, sensing the current, began to position himself as the channel through which Galba's favor could flow into Rome. He quietly promised the Praetorians rich rewards if they would recognize Galba when the moment came. The Senate did not yet act. The guard did not yet rise. The people did not yet revolt. But in every corner of the capital, the same question spread like a shadow. When the blow falls, which side will you be on? In the late summer of 68, Nero finally left Greece, not in triumph, as he had dreamed, but in unease. Messages from Rome had grown harder to dismiss. The praises in the letters felt hollow, and the silences between them heavier. Galba was no longer a rumor. He was a declared enemy of the state, moving with the discipline of a commander who knew time was on his side. Still, Nero did not rush. His return was a slow, ceremonial journey, punctuated by performances in cities along the way. He seemed determined to convince himself, and the world, that his reign was unshaken. Yet his entourage began to thin. Some senators excused themselves for urgent affairs back in Italy, others slipped away at night, vanishing into the uncertain currents of politics. When Nero landed in Italy, the welcome was cool. The cheering crowds of his earlier years were absent. In their place were silent streets and guarded eyes. Word had spread that Galba had secured the loyalty of the legions in Hispania, and more dangerously, that the Praetorian Guard in Rome was restless. Nymphidius Sabinus now moved openly. He whispered to the guard that Nero had already abandoned them, that Galba had promised them a richer donative than any emperor before. In exchange, they need only recognize him when the moment came. The guard listened and nodded. Nero's advisors urged decisive action, recall Galba to Rome for trial, send loyal commanders to the provinces, secure the grain supply, and above all, appear in person before the Praetorians to renew their loyalty. But Nero's mind was elsewhere. He fretted over whether his laurel wreaths from Greece would be paraded properly, whether his crowns had been stored without damage, and whether Rome would honor him as the greatest artist of the age. In the Senate, masks were dropping. A growing bloc now treated Galba not as a rebel but as the likely successor. Some began to send discreet envoys to Hispania, offering allegiance in exchange for future favor. Those who still backed Nero did so out of fear of his wrath, yet even they began to wonder if his wrath was worth fearing much longer. The road before Nero was narrowing, the walls pressing in. He could still strike, still move with the force of an emperor, still rally the city and the guard to his side. But each day he hesitated, the choice slipped further from his hands. And far to the west, Galba kept marching. In Rome, the tipping point came quietly, without trumpets or open declarations. Nymphidius Sabinus had worked his web well. Over wine and in shadowed corners of the Praetorian barracks, he spoke of loyalty, not to Nero, but to Rome, to the Senate, and to the empire's future. He painted Galba as the antidote to the chaos of recent years, the man who would reward them lavishly for their service. Gold was a persuasive argument. Nymphidius promised each guardsman more than they had ever received at an emperor's accession. The sum was not yet in Galba's coffers, but the promise alone gleamed brighter than Nero's fading favors. When the guard assembled in the Castra Praetoria, their demeanor toward Nero's envoys had changed. Where once they saluted sharply, now their eyes slid away, their movements slow and indifferent. A few openly questioned whether the emperor even intended to return to the city or whether he would linger in Naples, playing the Cythera while the empire unraveled. In the Senate, reports filtered in, Galba had been acclaimed emperor by his troops in Clunia. Though still far from Rome, his march toward the capital had gained momentum. Local governors along the route declared for him. The balance was shifting. Nero, in his villa outside Rome, received the news late. He summoned a meeting of advisers, but what came was less a council of war than a chorus of evasions. Some flattered him still, urging patience, saying Galba's rebellion would falter. Others counseled him to take the field himself. Nero listened, nodded, and then asked about preparations for his next performance in the theater. The guard's betrayal was not yet open, but it no longer needed to be. Their loyalty was a hollow shell. In the palace, servants whispered of senators vanishing into the night, their carriages heading west toward Galba's camp. The machinery of power that had once turned smoothly for Nero now ground slowly, as though clogged by sand. Nymphidius Sabinus knew the moment was close. All it would take was a single rumor, true or false, that Galba was near, and the guard would turn fully. He prepared for that moment with the patience of a man who understood that coups were not won in battle but in the hours before dawn. And as the city slept uneasily, the fate of an emperor hung not on armies or battles, but on the choice of a single garrison within Rome's walls. It began with a whisper in the dark. Shortly before dawn, a rumor swept through the Praetorian barracks: Galba had been proclaimed emperor by the Senate. Whether the news was true or not mattered little, the men believed it. Nymphidius Sabinus moved swiftly, telling the guard that Nero had fled the city, that their loyalty was now to Rome's new ruler. The word spread like sparks on dry grass. By mid-morning, the Praetorians abandoned their posts at the palace. Gates were left unguarded, corridors silent. Courtiers who came to report to the emperor found the chambers empty of protection. Some quietly slipped away. Others ran to their estates, fearing the chaos to come. Nero awoke to the sound of hurried footsteps and anxious voices. When told the guard had deserted, he laughed bitterly, convinced it was another court intrigue. But when he looked from the balcony and saw the palace courtyard deserted, the truth began to sink in. He called for his friends, his allies, anyone who would stand by him. No one came. The freedman who had managed his affairs melted away. The imperial treasury was sealed. Even the kitchen slaves had vanished. Only a handful of attendants remained, pale and silent. Panic took hold. Nero spoke of appealing to the people, of going to the Forum in his theatrical garb to win their hearts. But his attendants begged him to flee. The roads into the city were unsafe, mobs were already gathering. As the sun climbed higher, the Senate convened in emergency session. The mood was sharp and cold. No one rose in Nero's defense. Some argued for his arrest, others for his execution. By the end, they resolved to declare him a public enemy, a sentence that stripped him of all imperial protections. News of the Senate's decision reached Nero before noon. It broke him. The emperor who had once stood on the stage before thousands now trembled like a trapped animal. "Is there no one left," he asked, "who will not betray me?" Under the guidance of Phaon, one of his freedmen, Nero slipped from the palace through a rear exit, dressed in a simple tunic and hooded cloak. They rode hard through the back streets and out into the countryside, avoiding the main roads. The man who had commanded the empire now clung to his saddle in silence, glancing over his shoulder at every turn. Behind him, Rome buzzed with news of his fall. The streets were a chaos of shouts, some mourning, more rejoicing. And in the Castra Praetoria, the guard that had once sworn to protect him shouted Galba's name. Nero's reign was over. Only the manner of its end remained.